just talk a little bit about how this translates down to the level of T3. I do a lot of residential planning and residential work, but it'd be fun to kind of take you through an exercise of how, again, how it is that we look at how a building influences every aspect of how we look at it. When we encounter a building, we quickly recognize those buildings that are kind of comfortably holding their contents, doing what they do. It's also really evident when they don't, when we've got really bad proportions. It's the first thing that we encounter as we come up. It's pretty easy to quickly see whether or not a building respects its context, how it plays with the other buildings. To make really great buildings, I always kind of refer back to one of Leon Pierce's quotes that I love. Places of quality can be created only if plan, skyline, and organization form an evident bond, be they spectacular or modest within their means. And it says a lot. It's never, a building is never an object. It's always in a context, and how we manage that context, I find matters. The exercise that we're going to go through in a little bit, we have a property that I'll show you, and I put a really bad building on it. The author will remain anonymous, but we'll kind of talk about how that building, we'll talk through how that building works and how it doesn't work on that property, and it also has a form, a low elevation at the end of that, on the second page, which is equally as bad, just because its form is just too big. It's too much. Is that better? Thank you, James. So just some of the points that I kind of go through that I've listed on this plan sheet. Appropriateness. The building's civic duty is. Sorry, folks. Give me a second to set up. One of the first things that I'll always do with these properties is kind of review the context. I'm a big fan of fabric buildings in a lot of what we do. Without fabric buildings within neighborhood context, punctuations don't work. If everything is special, then nothing's special. So if we kind of set a baseline for neighborhoods, baselines for houses, keep them a little bit quiet, and that allows really great buildings, corners, ends, or like the one that Eric just designed to work really beautifully. Those are the most successful neighborhoods, the most successful conditions that at least I encounter. But the building itself, one of the things that I always try to do is kind of consider how this building is going to work from the standpoint of its public realm, the semi-public realm, and then the private realm. Why does it that the building needs to respond to in the neighborhood, but also how does the building respond to its occupants, and how does it live within and rest within a property? Massing and proportion is really, really critical too. I guess what I'm going to, when we talk about appropriateness and context, let me kind of back up and show you the parcel that we're going to play with at this particular site design. You've got a little map in the upper left-hand corner showing that you've kind of got a corner lot that faces a park. That's kind of a side street, lane, front street, side street, rear lane, and again, it's on a park. And this is kind of what is happening around it, where this is the context of the neighborhood, approaching the corner lot, which is right here, which once again, is a larger version right here. And these are some. This is one of the. This is actually the neighboring building, which is what it is. Another neighboring building. Again, just kind of a sense of what this context is. So it's it's evident. There's T3. It's really kind of soft, comfortable, soft environment that we have to work in. And once again, the lot is pretty good size. It's about 50 feet wide, 100 feet long. So we'll have about a 40-foot platform to work with. And again, just for not only for scale, but for purposes of this exercise, I threw a building on that you often find. Buildings, residential buildings, are driven by lots of different programs. We've got the room count and just the general notion of what it is that the client will want. And one of the things that happens often is that the scale, particularly in urban conditions, the scale of the building gets really out of hand. And when we talk a little bit about defining the public realm and private, semi-private realm, and the semi-public realm and the private realm, the public realm clearly on this property is the street frontage. In this particular instance, we've got a relatively small porch, and ultimately, if you kind of look at this, just the pure scale of this building, there's no private realm whatsoever. It's just hard to develop in that courtyard. So one of the tools that we use to kind of create a better organization for form to make this building play a little bit more effectively with its neighbors. You can see that the neighboring houses also are relatively modest. They're not large houses. So part of some of the tools that I'll look at again in defining. Okay, we've got a building. Here's our site. We've got a building that is proposed that's a little too large. The massing's not very nice. What is it that we can look at? The massing and proportion is kind of the second step that, or an important step to consider. And as I had mentioned before, that organization, the plan organization, affects how it is that form and proportion and massing are going to work. So I guess let's just jump in. I'm just going to start rolling with you a little bit. And on a small scale, something like 1/16 of an inch. Hope we can see this okay. Just this out. I think that before I jump in, I'm just going to kind of run through some of these points first, and then back up and go do the exercise if that's okay. Talk a little bit about the organization, the massing and proportion. We've got to respect the context. Simple massing generally is the key to success. And interestingly, just like the example that I was showing you, more often than not, when we don't control this massing, our roof forms are the things that get really, really out of hand. So controlling the scale, controlling our forms, and actually distributing those forms when our program gets too big is one of the most useful tools that I've found. When it comes to the organization of kind of the plan, in all of this, plan matters. To activate a building, to activate a site, that's one of the things that all of these techniques and all of these considerations kind of play together. For instance, when we look at a very long building like this, not only is it not addressing the public space very well, but interestingly, even though it's only two rooms wide, it's it's 3 or 4 rooms deep. So that means it becomes fairly dark. And that means most rooms will have one wall of glass, the edges have 2. If we can look at kind of holding our building such that, or working with our building such that we simplify our form, keeping them, maximum of 2 rooms deep, whenever possible. And actually working with scale too. This building is kind of ultimately a 4-bay wide building, which is a little difficult to work with as it sits currently. So if you kind of maybe look at kind of where this building sits on the property, start looking at, okay, how would I want this thing to address the public? This is one of those great opportunities where corner porch, starts to work very nicely. The other, but from the standpoint of just pure organization, if in fact we've got primary massing, which addresses the front, and then we are going to have a parking structure in the back, and it's always nice to kind of hold on to and anchor the corner of our alleys with the parking. Once we start getting into a rational, reasonable form on the frontage building, the comparison between that size and this garage, which was 20 foot by 20 foot or 22 foot by 22 foot animal, is always really tough. So one of the first things that I'll try to do is make sure that we, in fact, do anything we can to start breaking down the scale of the garage, such that you might have, again, primary massing and then secondary mass that might be a shed roof or something of that nature, where in fact you get a much smaller principal form for the garage, and then the remaining space is a little softer. I'll show you some examples in a little bit, but a little softer for the change of roof type. There, we start looking at the opportunity of saying, okay, well, how now we have this space in the middle, how can we begin to start defining a nice courtyard? Well, we still have kind of this bedroom notion, this other part of the program that, we can start looking at working on the third edge of the courtyard design, where we have anchors in the back, a relatively simple massing in front, and then a secondary massing in the middle, which I'll get cleaned up in just a minute. And then porches, this is one of those houses that, we can start looking at how porches work and also how connections start to happen. If, in fact, these are principal elements, this is where, with our larger roofs. I'm going to clean this up real quick. So. Lots of trace papers good in the design process. And when we start looking at just that diagram of how forms can work well for us, principal massing, and then secondary massing elements. This guy. Then we can start looking at how we connect these elements, to start addressing not only the definition of outdoor, private, public, semi-public, and private spaces, but also the connection of the program, the organization of the building. So once again, we'll kind of start with, this is one of those great places where, again, we can just kind of look at a variety of porches. This is one that, notice that we've made the building shell smaller so far. This square footage clearly doesn't match the square footage of the overall original house. So there are great ways to try to start compensating for that program while maintaining rational and reasonable massing and proportion. So if we've got our porch forms, we start to work around this house. We clearly can start in a position where we start trying to improve the courtyard area here.
And by the way, courtyard next door.
Yeah. And then using lower roof types or lower roof lines, like shed roofs or porches, kind of connect some of the remainder of the elements. We begin to start seeing something that responds a little bit more effectively to the overall lot.
What Eric's doing here is really strong because I find it really exciting to see this because oftentimes when we see too much of something, buildings just occupy space. What Eric's doing here is he's actually using the buildings to make a space on the lot, which is really where a lot of times people miss that. They focus so much on the architecture of the object and not thinking about how the buildings can actually make an occupiable space and a private space.
Thank you, Eric. Keep going. I'll just drop. But again, so we start getting we'll take a look at how this plan starts to inform the form of the building. But we just kind of it's pretty easy, it's pretty evident to kind of see what's coming up. But now, of course, we talked a little bit about this relationship of interior space to exterior space. First, I'm a fan of getting as much exterior space as we can, actually reducing the size of interior space and maximizing exterior space in this kind of environment, in this southern climate, where we can actually stay outside 6 to 9 months a year. It's nice to actually entice us out to these porches. And that was part of this plan organization too. These porches and this plan, the activation of these outside edges are only as good as this plan inside. So, if we start looking at how we actually plan some of these pieces, you'll notice that original plan. You may have noticed we had a formal dining room in front of it, a den, which is nice. But sometimes you'll see in these houses that will have beautiful front porches. But when you look at plan, there may be a master bathroom on one half of it, and there may be a small library, something that's not necessarily public, something that it won't draw the occupants to the frontage porch. And if that frontage porch isn't used, then again, as I mentioned before, they become cartoons. So this is part of where just a simple plan organization becomes really important. If we don't activate these porches, or the only way to activate these porches is to, in my opinion, to entice us to them. Just from a simple plan standpoint, that means that generally, if this is only 2 rooms deep, making that as transparent as possible, such that there's living and dining in a relatively open space, and getting rid of redundancies, maybe a little less formal plans, and actually allowing a kitchen, that actually opens up too, that starts to activate the private side. But living and dining, when we can actually make these areas more transparent, the plan more transparent, that means that life that Eric was talking about, that we like to see as we pass buildings, starts to happen. We're much more likely to activate this porch and actually visit with the folks that are outside, and vice versa. We need the interest from the sidewalk because there's actually life inside the house. So these porches aren't just furniture; they actually start to create. They start to entice people as well to use them. And again, there's kind of a clear and evident difference between what might be. And I'll get back to program once again and suggest that, okay, when we have maybe this extended porches, this is where we actually have the opportunity to come back and reclaim portions of it. Eric was talked a little bit about how we kind of get these great rhythms of windows. If we come back and actually reclaim portions of our porch, we actually extend our living space. That's where we start to also regain some of the lost plan program in a smaller interval. So
when you were talking about this ground floor, about opening up and living this way, this is really important. This is about what we talked about earlier some other life into it. Because when you look back at historical models, you have to be a little careful. Sometimes the plans don't necessarily reflect what maybe where the way people want to live today.
So again, once we start looking at some of our roof lines, this starts to tie together. You start to get a pretty clear indication of what our big pieces are and what our small pieces are. And this is also one of the, there's always so many different ways to actually address a property. This property is 50 feet wide. A single 40-foot wide, single room deep, 40-foot wide, 5-bay building here would also be very appropriate. So there are lots of different ways to handle the plan portion. When we take this, now we can kind of take this notion of this plan and see how it translates to elevation. So I'll do this. We have 5 minutes left. Essentially, what happens when we're able to break down our massing, or distribute the architecture throughout a property, break down the massing, primary structures and secondary structures. What we were able to start doing, and I'll pick this kind of, since I've only got 5 minutes left, I'll kind of play with this side elevation only. But we start to create much more human scale forms. It starts to feel a little bit better, a little bit more rational, reasonable in the scale. Space. Actually, not good enough program. Did you say something about that? But that's again, just the simple technique, I guess. What this exercise is about is kind of looking at the program in the context of the property, trying to use our building forms to address the property itself, and actually make sure that we create or that we define our private spaces, our private realms and our public realms very, very carefully. Address them carefully such that we can activate the edges. Yeah, let's do. That's where that is where I wanted to go. So let's go with any
We're at the
questions.
end of our time, but we have time for any questions.
We have just about a minute or so left in here. Before everybody leaves, though, I'd like to have a big thanks to Eric and Eric for being here. Thanks so much, you guys. I know you guys aren't used to working so much trying to narrate while you're driving and so forth, so thanks so much for giving us the opportunity to see how you work. So any questions? If anybody has any questions? And actually, we've got the sign-in sheets for the AIA credits back here. I believe the session is going to be logged in for AICP credits as well, so you can do that online as you normally would with the AIA credits in the back here. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Lee.